The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The man he'd destroyed was now seeking his help against an even greater threat. It was a perfect example of how the apocalypse had scrambled traditional notions of alliance and enmity. In the old world, Harrison would have been in prison for his crimes. In this new reality, he might be their best hope for stopping an even worse tyrant. The negotiation took hours. Harrison provided detailed intelligence about Brennan's forces, their equipment, patrol routes, and defensive positions. In exchange, he wanted weapons, supplies, and a promise that he wouldn't be handed over to the communities he'd previously exploited. It was a devil's bargain, but Marcus had learned that survival sometimes required making deals with devils. Elena opposed the alliance from the beginning. This man terrorized families, stole medicine from sick children, and you want to arm him? How is that different from what Brennan is doing? Because Harrison is offering to help us stop someone worse, Marcus replied. And because we can control Harrison. His power base is gone, his men are dead or scattered. He needs us more than we need him. The debate split the group. Some, like David and Patricia, supported the alliance as a tactical necessity. Others, including several newer members who had been victimized by Harrison's people, threatened to leave rather than work with him. The moral compromises required for survival were becoming increasingly complex and personal. Marcus made the decision unilaterally, accepting Harrison's intelligence and giving him basic weapons and supplies. It was a choice that would define his leadership and test the loyalty of his followers. He was no longer the reluctant teacher thrust into a leadership role. He was becoming a calculating strategist willing to make hard choices for what he believed was the greater good. The plan they developed was ambitious and dangerous. Brennan's main base was a fortified shopping mall with multiple levels and excellent defensive positions. A direct assault would be suicidal, but Marcus had learned that even the best defenses could be compromised by unconventional tactics. They would use the infected again, but this time with greater precision and coordination. Harrison provided detailed maps of the mall's layout, including service tunnels and utility areas that Brennan's people had overlooked. There were several large infected populations trapped in nearby buildings, a department store, a parking garage, and a residential complex that had been sealed off since the early days of the outbreak. The key insight came from Patricia, who had been studying infected behavior patterns. They're attracted to specific frequencies of sound, she explained during a planning session. Not just noise but certain pitches and rhythms that mimic human distress calls. If we can create coordinated signals, we can. Marcus Rivera pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned warehouse, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid December air. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, and what remained of Boston looked nothing like the bustling city he once called home. The streets were littered with overturned cars, shattered glass, and the remnants of a civilization that had crumbled faster than anyone thought possible. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond the loading dock, a constant reminder that the infected were never far away. He clutched his makeshift weapon, a crowbar he'd found in the maintenance room, and tried to steady his trembling hands. At 34, Marcus had been a middle school history teacher before the world ended. He'd spent his days talking about ancient civilizations and their rise and fall, never imagining he'd witness the collapse of his own society. His wife Elena and their 8-year-old daughter Sophia were somewhere in this maze of industrial buildings, hopefully safe in the temporary shelter they'd established in the old office complex 2 blocks north. The group had been together for 6 weeks now, ever since they'd fled the overrun refugee camp in Cambridge. There were 12 of them initially, families who had banded together for survival. But numbers had dwindled as they faced impossible choices and devastating losses. Now only 7 remained: Marcus and his family, David Chin and his teenage son Tommy, retired nurse Patricia Williams, and young couple Jake and Amanda Peterson. What made their situation particularly desperate wasn't just the infected roaming the streets. It was Captain Robert Harrison, a former National Guard officer who had appointed himself leader of a militaristic survivor group that controlled the downtown area. Harrison's people had weapons, vehicles, and a fortified position in the old federal building. They also had a twisted sense of justice that involved taking whatever they wanted from smaller groups like Marcus's. 2 days ago, Harrison's men had cornered them during a supply run to the old grocery store on Commonwealth Avenue. They demanded half of everything the group had scavenged: food, medicine, blankets, even personal items. When David had protested, saying his son Tommy needed the antibiotics they'd found for his infected wound, Harrison had laughed coldly. He'd told them that weakness wasn't tolerated in his new world order, and that they were lucky he was letting them keep anything at all. The encounter had left Marcus seething with anger and frustration. Here was a man who was supposed to protect people, using his authority and firepower to prey on the vulnerable. It reminded him of the worst bullies he'd dealt with as a teacher. Those who used their size and influence to torment others simply because they could. But this wasn't a school playground. This was life and death, and Harrison's actions were literally taking food from the mouths of children. As Marcus waited in the shadows, listening for any sign of the infected, he thought about the plan he'd been developing. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it might be their only chance to level the playing field. He'd noticed that Harrison's group had grown complacent in their fortress-like position. They'd become overconfident, sending out smaller patrols and leaving their main compound less heavily guarded than before. The sound of footsteps made him freeze. But these weren't the irregular, dragging steps of the infected. These were purposeful human footsteps. Marcus peered around the corner and saw Elena approaching, moving carefully between the abandoned vehicles. She carried their backpack, the one containing their most precious possessions, and her face was pale with worry. "The others are getting restless," she whispered when she reached him. "Patricia thinks we should just give Harrison what he wants and try to find somewhere else to go." "But where can we go, Marcus? Every safe place is already claimed by someone with more guns than us." Marcus pulled his wife closer, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. These people looked to him for answers, for leadership, even though he'd never asked for that role. He was just a teacher who'd managed to keep his family alive when everything fell apart. But maybe that was exactly what made him different from men like Harrison. He hadn't let the apocalypse turn him into a monster. "I have an idea," he said quietly, watching the distant glow of fires burning in the city center. "It's dangerous, but it might be our only shot at stopping Harrison's people from bleeding us dry. We can't keep running forever, Elena. Eventually we're going to have to make a stand." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Tommy Chin had developed a fever during the night, and the infection in his leg was spreading despite Patricia's best efforts with their dwindling medical supplies. David sat beside his son's makeshift bed, his face etched with desperation and fear. The antibiotics Harrison's men had taken could have saved the boy's life, but now they were probably sitting and used in some military storage room while a child suffered. Marcus gathered the group in the old break room they'd converted into their meeting space. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the faces of people who had been pushed to their breaking point. Jake Peterson, barely 22, looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few months. His girlfriend Amanda clutched his hand tightly, her eyes red from crying. They'd lost their infant daughter to the infected just before joining the group. "We can't keep playing by Harrison's rules," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "He's not going to stop taking from us until there's nothing left to take. And then what? We die slowly instead of quickly?" Patricia Williams, who had worked as a trauma nurse for 30 years before retiring, looked up from checking Tommy's pulse. "What are you suggesting, Marcus? We can't fight them head-on. They have military training and automatic weapons. We have a crowbar and a couple of kitchen knives." "I'm not talking about a direct confrontation," Marcus replied. "I'm talking about using what we know about human nature. Harrison's people are bullies, but they're also human. They have the same fears and weaknesses as anyone else. They're afraid of the infected, they're afraid of losing their safe space, and they're afraid of being seen as weak by their followers." David looked up from his son's bedside, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus pulled out a hand-drawn map of the downtown area, marking the locations he'd scouted over the past few weeks. Harrison's compound has one major weakness. It's surrounded by infected zones that his people have been avoiding. They've gotten comfortable in their fortress, but they haven't been clearing the areas around it. There are hundreds of infected trapped in the underground parking garage of the building next door, and more in the subway tunnels beneath the street. Elena realized where this was heading. "Marcus, you can't be serious. You're talking about unleashing the infected on other people. That makes us no better than Harrison." "Does it?" Marcus asked, his teacher instincts kicking in as he prepared to make his case. "Harrison's people aren't innocent civilians. They're armed thugs who prey on families with children. They're the reason Tommy is dying right now. They're the reason we're all slowly starving while they live in comfort. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show them what it feels like to be powerless." The room fell silent except for Tommy's labored breathing. Everyone understood the moral complexity of what Marcus was suggesting. In the old world, such an action would have been unthinkable, using the infected as weapons against other survivors. But this wasn't the old world. This was a place where former soldiers stole medicine from dying children and called it survival of the fittest. Jake was the first to speak. "How would it work?" How do we control something like that? Marcus spread out more detailed sketches, showing the underground layout he'd mapped during his reconnaissance missions. We don't control it. We just create an opening and let nature take its course. The infected will follow the path of least resistance toward the loudest sounds and strongest scents. If we can breach the barriers keeping them trapped underground, they'll naturally move toward Harrison's compound, especially if there's something to attract them. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. And what about innocent people? What if there are kids in that compound? Harrison doesn't allow children in his group, Patricia said quietly. I heard him say it himself during that confrontation. He considers them liabilities. Everyone in that building is a willing participant in his operation. The debate continued for hours, with each member of the group wrestling with the moral implications of Marcus's plan. But as Tommy's condition worsened and their own supplies dwindled, the harsh reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. They were facing a choice between certain death through slow starvation and exploitation, or taking a calculated risk that might level the playing field. By evening they had reached a consensus. David, watching his son slip away from fever and infection, was the most vocal supporter of the plan. My boy is dying because of Harrison's greed, he said, his voice breaking. If we don't do something now, we'll all be dead within a month anyway. The preparation took 2 days. Marcus and Jake worked together to scout the underground areas, identifying the weak points in the barriers that kept the infected contained. They discovered that the parking garage held at least 200 infected, former office workers and shoppers who had been trapped when the outbreak began. The creatures had been surviving on rats and each other, but they were still mobile and dangerous. Elena and Amanda focused on creating distractions, devices that would make noise and attract the infected toward Harrison's compound once they were released. They used old cell phones with dying batteries, setting them to play music and ring at timed intervals. Patricia worked on treating Tommy's infection with what little they had, while also preparing medical supplies for the injuries they might sustain during the operation. Marcus spent his time studying Harrison's patrol schedules and identifying the best time to strike. He'd learned that the compound was most vulnerable during the evening shift change, when the guards were distracted and communication was at its lowest. The building's main entrance faced the street where the infected would emerge, making it the logical target for the swarm. On the night of the operation, Marcus gathered his team one final time. They had decided that only 3 people would carry out the actual mission: Marcus, Jake, and David. The others would remain at the warehouse with Tommy and be ready to evacuate if things went wrong. Remember, Marcus said, checking his watch, we're not trying to wipe out Harrison's entire group. We're trying to create enough chaos to weaken their position and maybe force them to reconsider their tactics. Once we breach the parking garage, we have maybe 20 minutes before the infected reach the compound. That's our window to get back to safety. The trio moved through the abandoned streets like ghosts, avoiding the patrol routes they'd memorized over the past weeks. The city at night was a different kind of terrifying, darker, quieter, with sounds that could be either wind or something far more dangerous. They reached the parking garage entrance without incident, finding the steel barriers exactly as Marcus had described. David carried the bolt cutters they'd found in a construction site, while Jake had the noise makers. Marcus held his crowbar and a small battery-powered radio that would serve as their primary distraction device. The plan was simple but required precise timing: cut through the barriers, place the noise makers to guide the infected toward Harrison's compound, then retreat to a safe distance and wait. The first barrier gave way easily, the metal corroded from months of neglect. But as soon as the gap appeared, they could hear the infected stirring in the darkness beyond. The smell hit them immediately, a nauseating combination of decay and human waste that made Jake gag and cover his mouth. Stay focused, Marcus whispered, though his own hands were shaking. We do this fast and we get out. They worked in silence, cutting through 2 more barriers and creating a clear path from the garage to the street level. The infected were becoming more agitated now, drawn by the fresh scents and sounds of living humans. Marcus could see shapes moving in the darkness, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all pressing toward the new opening. Jake placed the first noisemaker just outside the garage entrance, setting it to activate in 10 minutes. The second went at the intersection that would direct the infected toward Harrison's compound. The third was placed near the compound's main entrance, timed to go off just as the swarm arrived. As they prepared to retreat, David suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm. Wait, he whispered urgently. Look. Through the darkness, they could see movement near Harrison's compound. A patrol was returning early, their flashlights cutting through the night as they approached the main entrance. If the infected were released now, Those men would be caught in the open, completely unprepared for what was coming. Marcus felt a moment of doubt. These were still human beings, regardless of their allegiance to Harrison. But then he thought of Tommy lying in fever, of Elena's hollow cheeks from hunger, of all the families Harrison's people had terrorized and robbed. This was justice, he told himself. This was what happened when people chose to be predators instead of protectors. The first noisemaker activated exactly on schedule, its electronic melody echoing through the underground garage. The response was immediate and terrifying, a chorus of moans and shuffling feet as hundreds of infected began moving toward the sound. Marcus, Jake, and David retreated to their observation point on the roof of a nearby building, watching as their plan unfolded below. The infected poured out of the garage like water from a broken dam, their pale forms clearly visible in the moonlight. They moved with surprising coordination, following the path of noisemakers toward Harrison's compound. The patrol team spotted them first, their shouts of alarm cutting through the night air. Gunfire erupted as the soldiers tried to fight their way back to the building, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected. Marcus watched through binoculars as chaos consumed the compound. Emergency floodlights snapped on, revealing the full scope of the swarm pressing against the building's defenses. Harrison's voice could be heard over a megaphone, shouting orders and trying to coordinate a response. But it was clear that his people had never faced anything like this before. They'd grown soft in their fortress, unprepared for a sustained assault. The infected began breaking through the compound's ground floor windows, drawn by the lights and sounds of human activity inside. More gunfire echoed through the night, followed by screams and the crash of breaking glass. Marcus found himself gripping the edge of the roof, torn between satisfaction at seeing Harrison's arrogance finally challenged and horror at the violence he'd unleashed. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered beside him. There are so many of them. David said nothing, but his face was grim with determination. His son was dying, and this chaos represented their only chance of getting the medical supplies needed to save him. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on all of them, but survival had a way of clarifying difficult choices. The battle raged for over an hour. Harrison's people fought desperately, using military tactics and superior firepower to hold defensive positions within the building. But the infected were relentless, pouring through every breach and overwhelming isolated defenders. The compound's radio chatter grew increasingly panicked as sections of the building fell one by one. Around midnight the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the chaos had been. Marcus could see fires burning inside the compound, but there was no more gunfire, no more shouted orders. The infected continued to mill around the building, but their frenzied assault had ended. Is it over? Jake asked quietly. Marcus wasn't sure. The plan had been to create chaos, not to destroy Harrison's entire operation. But the swarm had been larger and more aggressive than he'd anticipated. The compound's defenses, which had seemed so formidable from the outside, had crumbled quickly once breached. They waited until dawn before attempting to approach the compound. The infected had largely dispersed, drawn away by other sounds and scents throughout the city. The building itself was a wreck. Windows shattered, doors torn from their hinges, smoke still rising from fires within. Marcus led his team through the devastation, searching for survivors and, more importantly, for the medical supplies that could save Tommy's life. They found Harrison in what had been his command center on the third floor. The former National Guard captain was barricaded behind an overturned desk, wounded but alive. His face was pale with shock and blood loss, a far cry from the arrogant commander who had been stealing from families just days before. "You," Harrison said when he saw Marcus. His voice was weak but filled with rage. "You did this. You brought them here." Marcus stood over the man who had been terrorizing his group, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. "You did this to yourself," he replied. "You chose to be a predator instead of a protector. This is what happens when you forget that we're all fighting the same enemy." Harrison tried to reach for a pistol beside him, but his wounded arm wouldn't cooperate. "You think you're some kind of hero? You just murdered 20 good people." "Good people don't steal medicine from dying children," Marcus replied. "Good people don't use their strength to prey on the weak." They found the medical supplies in a storage room that had been untouched by the infected. Antibiotics, painkillers, bandages, enough to treat Tommy and have reserves for future emergencies. As they gathered what they needed, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of what they'd done. 20 people were dead because of his plan, and while he told himself they were necessary casualties in a larger struggle for survival, the guilt was still there. The journey back to the warehouse felt like walking through a nightmare. The streets were littered with evidence of the night's violence, abandoned weapons, torn clothing, and blood stains that told the story of desperate last stands. Some of Harrison's people had escaped, but their organization was broken. The compound that had represented safety and power just hours before was now a tomb. When they arrived at the warehouse, Patricia immediately began treating Tommy with the recovered antibiotics. The boy's fever broke within hours, and his infected wound began showing signs of improvement. David wept with relief as he watched his son's breathing become easier and more regular. The mission had been successful in its primary objective. They had saved a life. But the group's dynamic had changed. Elena looked at her husband differently now, seeing a man capable of calculated destruction that she'd never imagined possible. Amanda questioned whether they were becoming the very monsters they'd been fighting against. Even Patricia, who had initially supported the plan, expressed doubts about the methods they'd used. "We crossed a line," Elena said during a private moment with Marcus. "I understand why you did it, but we crossed a line that we can never uncross." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of leadership in a way he'd never experienced as a teacher. "Maybe we did. But Tommy is alive because we crossed that line. And maybe that's what survival looks like in this world, making impossible choices and living with the consequences." Over the following days they learned more about the aftermath of their attack. Some of Harrison's surviving men had joined other groups, spreading word about what had happened. The story grew in the telling. Marcus's small group of survivors had become legendary figures who could command the infected like weapons. Other survivor communities began seeking them out, some wanting to join their group, others wanting to eliminate them as a threat. The attention was both a blessing and a curse. They gained new members, families who had been victims of Harrison's exploitation and saw Marcus as a liberator. But they also became targets for other militaristic groups who viewed them as dangerous revolutionaries. The warehouse was no longer safe, and they were forced to move constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days. Jake and Amanda decided to leave the group, unable to reconcile their conscience with what they'd participated in. They took supplies and headed north, hoping to find a community that hadn't been touched by the violence consuming the city. Their departure was painful but understandable. Not everyone was equipped to make the moral compromises that survival sometimes demanded. 3 weeks after the attack on Harrison's compound, Marcus stood watch on the roof of their new hideout, an abandoned school on the outskirts of the city. The building reminded him of his old life, of the classroom where he'd taught students about the rise and fall of civilizations. Now he was living through the collapse of his own society, watching as humanity struggled to define itself in the aftermath of catastrophe. David approached with his son Tommy, who had recovered completely from his infection. The boy was playing with a toy car they'd found in one of the classrooms, his laughter a rare sound of innocence in their harsh new world. David's gratitude was evident in every interaction, but Marcus could also see the fear in the man's eyes, fear of what Marcus might be capable of, fear of what they'd all become. "Do you think we're the good guys?" David asked, watching his son play. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think we're the guys who do what needs to be done to protect the people we care about. Whether that makes us good or bad depends on who's telling the story." The infected were still out there, shambling through the ruins of civilization. Other groups of survivors were still fighting for resources and territory. The world remained dangerous and unpredictable. But Tommy was alive, their group had medicine and supplies, and they'd proven that they wouldn't be victims in this new reality. As the sun set over the broken city, Marcus reflected on the teacher he'd been and the leader he'd become. The apocalypse had changed him in ways he was still discovering, blurring the lines between protector and predator, between justice and revenge. He'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to become something more frightening than they were. 2 months had passed since the destruction of Harrison's compound, and winter was settling over the ruins of Boston with brutal efficiency. The group had found semi-permanent shelter in an underground metro station that connected to several buildings, giving them multiple escape routes if needed. Their numbers had grown to 15 people, including several families who had sought them out after hearing stories of their successful resistance against the militaristic groups. Marcus had become something he'd never intended to be, a warlord in all but name. Communities throughout the area knew of him, some with respect, others with fear. His reputation as someone who could turn the infected into weapons had grown far beyond the reality of what had happened at Harrison's compound. Other groups sent emissaries seeking alliances or came bearing tribute in hopes of avoiding his wrath. The moral complexity of his position weighed on him daily. Elena had adapted to their new reality, taking charge of organizing supplies and coordinating with other survivor communities. She'd become skilled at reading people's intentions and identifying potential threats. Their daughter Sophia had grown quiet and watchful, her childhood innocence replaced by a premature understanding of danger and survival. One morning, a runner arrived with disturbing news. A new group had moved into the area, military deserters led by a colonel named William Brennan who had abandoned his post when the government evacuation failed. Brennan's forces were well-equipped and disciplined, and they'd been systematically taking control of survivor communities through a combination of intimidation and protection rackets. They're different from Harrison's people, the runner explained, a young woman named Kelly who had escaped from one of Brennan's recently conquered settlements. They don't just take supplies and leave. They take over completely. Anyone who resists disappears. They've got vehicles, heavy weapons, and they're organized like a real military unit. Marcus studied the intelligence reports Kelly had brought. Brennan's group controlled a network of communities spanning nearly half the city, extracting tribute and forcing able-bodied survivors to work in labor gangs. Unlike Harrison's crude bullying, this was systematic oppression backed by military discipline and overwhelming firepower. David, who had become Marcus's closest advisor, reviewed the tactical situation with growing concern. We can't use the same strategy against these people. They're too spread out, too organized. And they'll be expecting some kind of retaliation after what happened to Harrison. Patricia, now serving as their chief medical officer and intelligence coordinator, had been mapping Brennan's operations. They've been asking questions about us specifically, offering rewards for information about our location and capabilities. They see us as a threat to their expansion plans. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Robert Harrison, the former National Guard captain who had survived the attack on his compound, stood in their security checkpoint under heavy guard. He was thinner now, his face marked by recent injuries, but his eyes still held the arrogance that had made him so many enemies. "I want to talk to Rivera," Harrison announced to the guards. "Tell him I have information he needs about Brennan." Marcus debated whether to see the man at all. Harrison represented everything he'd been fighting against: the abuse of authority, the exploitation of the weak, the transformation of protectors into predators. But intelligence was precious in their world, and Harrison had spent weeks observing Brennan's operations while planning his own comeback. They met in the station's old ticket office, with David and Patricia present as witnesses. Harrison looked older than his 45 years, worn down by months of survival and the loss of his power base. But his military bearing remained intact, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Brennan's planning to move against you within the week," Harrison said without preamble. "He's consolidated enough resources to mount a proper military operation. 3 armored vehicles, 40 trained soldiers, and intelligence about your defensive positions." Marcus studied the man who had once terrorized his family. "Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?" Harrison's smile was cold but genuine. "Revenge. Brennan's people killed most of my remaining men when they took over the financial district. They didn't offer me a place in their organization. They wanted to eliminate potential rivals. The enemy of my enemy and all that. You want us to take down Brennan so you can rebuild your own operation," David said, his voice heavy with disgust. "I want Brennan dead," Harrison corrected. "What happens after that is negotiable. But right now you're the only force in the city with the capability to hurt him. You proved that when you used the infected against my compound." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The man he'd destroyed was now seeking his help against an even greater threat. It was a perfect example of how the apocalypse had scrambled traditional notions of alliance and enmity. In the old world, Harrison would have been in prison for his crimes. In this new reality, he might be their best hope for stopping an even worse tyrant.